So I'm going to be talking today about building landscape resilience through climate connectivity. If you attended the last webinar that I gave, it was about climate connectivity specifically for mammals. If you haven't seen it, you can check that out on our YouTube page. This talk is going to be very species independent. It's going to focus on more of the structural features across the landscape that promote connectivity and how we can use those to our advantage to build resilient corridors that, although they're not informed by species, they can be used by species. And then you must wonder, why is there this picture of mussels as the background? Well, I bring this picture up because last summer, so June and July of 2019, it was really hot in the Bay Area. It was so hot that mussels in the Bay Area were literally cooked alive on the rocks at the coast. So this is an example of how climate change can push the climate in a particular area, which is like the temperature, the rain, the fog. It can push it outside of what's historically normal. And some species, like these poor mussels, like they cannot cope with it. I personally don't study mussels, but I do study animals that can move. And so for animals that can move, there are a couple things that they can do if climate gets too hot for them. So here's a little figure with the green polygon representing what's comfortable for this newt that you see in the silhouette. If this is what's currently comfortable for the newt and climate changes and it moves the space of climate, the temperature and the rain that's comfortable for that animal, moves it out of what's normal. In this case, this newt can persist. It can survive where it is because you see there's a little overlap between the future, the dotted line, and the comfortable zone. So that newt can move into the comfortable zone and survive. But if the current climate or the comfortable climate space moves completely out of the future climate space, the poor little newt, he's going to perish, or she will perish. She's a goner. The cool thing about this is we don't have to leave it up to the climate. We can help the wildlife move into those more comfortable places using corridors or linkages. And so this is the question that I think about a lot is how can we help wildlife progress? And so the common method that's used is to increase the landscape permeability or the connectivity of the landscape by connecting really robust intact habitats to one another through corridors, for example. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what corridors are in a moment. And this idea of connectivity is extremely important, especially in places like the Bay Area and Northern California, actually all of California, places where you have a lot of topographic diversity. And you might experience that in something like a microclimate. So for example, you can drive maybe 15 miles inland from the coast, and the temperature is, can be something like 20 degrees different. So that kind of temperature shift or climate or temperature shift that changes in such a short distance is kind of a cool feature that we can use to our advantage, because if we can identify just those places that if you only have to go a little bit of distance and you can get to a cooler place, for example, that would be a really important feature or location to include for climate resilience, because it's like it's the easiest for animals or plants to get to. And some of these places that can be more buffered against future climate changes are things like steeps where cold groundwater comes out of the ground, north-facing slopes of mountains where the sun doesn't hit the ground as much tend to be moister and cooler, large water bodies, and so on. And these are known as refugia because they provide refuge from climate increases, so they're buffers. So these concepts are all what informed this project that I'm going to focus on today, which is the Mayacamas to Berryessa Connectivity Network. And it was a partnership between scientists and land managers at many different organizations. It was funded by the California LCP. And I want to take a moment here and just kind of read off the names of our partners because this project was essential, their participation and how they shaped it and helped it be successful. So Pepperwood and UC Berkeley were the scientific partners, and we also had input from USGS. Some of the land managers, which I might refer to as stakeholders, included the Bureau of Land Management, Sonoma County Parks, Sonoma County Ag and Open Space, Audubon Canyon Ranch, Sonoma Land Trust, the Land Trust in Napa County, and the Lake County Land Trust. So the main participants came from Lake, Napa, and Sonoma. So this project was a multi-county regional assessment, and there are, as I learned in this project, county boundaries can matter, like for how decisions are made and management is done to humans, but it doesn't really matter to the landscape. So it's kind of integrating what is needed by the landscape and what is needed by the jurisdictions that function on that landscape. So on the left, you'll see a map of our study area. It's a really large study area that extends from the bay all the way up beyond the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. That was a key feature in establishing the connectivity in this project. Was we wanted to see what connectivity looked like from the Mayacamas, which are kind of over near Healdsburg there on the map, up to across this study area to the Berryessa Range. And so let's see, this project had 5 components, and all of these were very interconnected, and I think that the interconnection, sorry to pun that out, but this is all about connection. So the interconnection between these 5 components was essential to the success of this project. So it started with stakeholder engagement. So the stakeholders participated in developing the grant proposal and defining what we did, which is not always done. Sometimes connectivity projects are more top-down, where the scientists do an analysis and hand off their findings and expect them to be applied by practitioners or land managers. Well, if the findings aren't what they need, they're not going to be applied. So we tried to spin that and inform what we did by what the stakeholders needed, which included things like jurisdictional specific emphasis, or land, just specific political or social issues that are going on in their region. So I think that was a huge win for the project, because at the very end, the stakeholders were thrilled with what we came up with and have been actively applying the products. So after we kind of defined the project, we assessed connectivity across all of the region, and we then used those connectivity assessments to inform a climate assessment. We integrated the climate and connectivity results to identify focal corridors that were identified as really important by the committee or the team to protect and implement. And then we provided a lot of ways that the stakeholders participating in the project could actually take what we did and apply it elsewhere. So I'm going to focus primarily on the science of what we did today, so mostly on the connectivity, the climate, and the corridor assessment. Starting with the connectivity assessment, our simple question was, what connectivity exists between the protected lands in our area? And how can we prioritize corridors that help wildlife progress, essentially? So how can we build linkages between like nice habitat and other nice habitat? And to measure that, we used an estimate called permeability. It's an estimate of how well animals or resources can move through the landscape. And in rough terms, here's a schematic. So it can be low, which is something like downtown Oakland if you were an animal. I know some bobcats and coyotes do move around there, but those are rare. So let's just, yeah, so those are low permeability. And then it kind of grades up to high permeability, which is just completely open, almost like humans aren't there at all. And in between, there's an intermediate transition zone. And because we had so many different participants, and there's a bunch of different words floating around about how you can talk about connectivity, early on we defined some terms that I'm going to apply during this talk. So we we defined potential linkages, so landscape linkages, as big swaths, places where there's a lot of connectivity, where it's pretty natural, where we predict that animals will be able to move pretty freely. And then at the core of those potential linkages are the least cost paths. So potential linkages, like I showed you in that previous slide, it's a continuum. So it can be from low to high. And it's mapped on this color scale like a heat map. But if you kind of zoom out and look at a whole map of that heat map, it can be kind of like overwhelming to the eye. So it's usually represented as a least cost path. So least cost path is like the skeleton of the potential linkage. So it represents the same information, but it's just like stripped of all the detail. And then we reserved the word corridor for when the potential linkages are translated into something that's implemented on the ground. So corridors are what linkages can become, or potential linkages can become, but we reserve corridor for applied on the ground conservation actions. So for with that housekeeping done, let me tell you about our connectivity metrics. So we evaluated two kinds of connectivity. We evaluated connectivity using a terrestrial approach and using a riparian approach. And so this is actually a really unique part of this project, is that a lot of connectivity analyses focus on the terrestrial permeability to identify places where wildlife can move across the landscape. By including riparian permeability, which is something that the stakeholders suggested, so this was really cool. We were also trying to capture places across the landscape that animals can move that might be missed in a terrestrial approach. So, I mean, animals definitely use stream corridors even when they're dry as navigational paths. They're kind of like little highways for wildlife. And in addition to that, a lot of places have in place protections for waterways. So if we can kind of show and demonstrate that waterways also improve wildlife movement, then you can have a double win, which is like it provides water quality and water benefits, and it can be an avenue for wildlife movement. What we did with our connectivity approach involved taking a measure of landscape permeability, and here for the terrestrial connectivity, we used an index of ecological integrity based on things like development, housing, land use, roads, And you see a map of it. It's a heat map on the right, no, the left. And it ranges from low to high. So brown is bad and greenish blue is good. And you can see that it's browner around Santa Rosa, Petaluma, and Napa. Those are more developed places. But there is a lot of our study area that was really high, had high ecological integrity. So that was really promising. The next thing we did was we plugged that ecological integrity data into a computer modeling program called Linkage Mapper. And we also plugged in protected areas. So those are the gray polygons you're seeing in the maps on the right and the middle. So we told the computer program, okay, use this map of ecological integrity, start at a protected area, and find a path to the next nearest protected area based on the best ecological integrity you can find. And that is how we got our potential linkages. And if the potential linkages map is a little busy for you, I'm also showing you the least cost paths. And one thing we noticed when we saw this was, okay, so it's a lot of noodles. I'll direct you to the least cost path. But I mean, there are noodles or least cost paths that kind of go in all directions. But if you squint your eyes, you can kind of see that there's an east-west orientation to these least cost paths. And I point that out because that is very different from what we found with the riparian connections. So here's what we did here's the results of the riparian connectivity analysis. So this time, instead of using ecological integrity as a starting point, we used riparian permeability. And that was really topographically defined. We looked for streams and like valley bottoms. We made an index of that, which is shown on the left. And then we used the same approach with Linkage Mapper to identify connections of the least cost between those protected areas using that input data, the riparian permeability. And the least cost paths that you see for the riparian permeability are pretty neat. There are fewer of them, and they also have a kind of more of a north-south, it's kind of like northwest, southeast, but it's more of a north-south orientation than the terrestrial linkages. And I'm going to toggle back. So here's the riparian, north-south, up and down, and here's the terrestrial, east-west or side-to-side. And that's pretty cool because this gives you two options to protect landscapes. You can go east to west, or you can go up and down. And so that gives land managers more options based on what they want to protect, and it gives them a way to justify some of the management decisions they use. So that was our connectivity assessment. Let's take a deep breath. Okay, next topic. So I'm going to show you how we use those connectivity results to evaluate climate resilience. So we're going to use the terrestrial linkages for this part. So as a little bit of context, actually, I think all of the stakeholders had lived in California for a pretty long time. So we had a sense that seasons matter in California. For example, one of the examples that a stakeholder provided was like, okay, if it's the summer and you want to go on a hike, are you going to go to the coast for that hike, or are you going to go like to Mount Diablo? Which one's going to be hotter? And the answer in the summer is the coast is going to be cooler in the summer. Mount Diablo is going to be really hot. But if you wanted to go to the cooler location in the winter, you don't go to the coast. You go to Mount Diablo. Sometimes Mount Diablo gets snow. And so when you're trying to identify these cooler places to give, wildlife access to a cooler place, it really matters whether you're thinking about what's the coolest place in the summer or the winter. So that's the reason why we decided to separate out the seasons for our climate analysis. And this schematic is kind of showing you, what could be the cooler place in the summer can very well be the the hotter place in the winter. And so we used mid-century, so estimates for 2040 to 2069. So mid-century estimates of climate to to assess the climate change that we expect to see in our study area. And so here's a trio of maps. So winter minimum is on the left, annual average is in the middle, and summer maximum is on the right. And what we saw when we compared these current or recent temperatures to the mid-century temperatures, so that those are each pair is recent and mid-century, what we saw is first, if you look at one pair of maps, so winter minimum, for example, the coolest places in the winter now are going to be the coolest places in the winter in 40 years. And that trend was consistent across winter, average, and summer temperature metrics. The other thing we saw was, again, like I said, the coolest places in the winter are not the same as the coolest places in the summer. So with that understanding, we were feeling pretty good that, separating out seasonal temperature extremes could be informative for looking at climate resilience in our area. The other thing that was a really sad takeaway from this is that across our whole study area, there were no places projected to decrease in temperature. The whole study area across all three of these variables were projected to increase anywhere from 2 to 2.6 degrees Celsius. That's, I think that's something like upwards of several degrees Fahrenheit. So that was really sad. We did have a moment of silence for the lost cool temperatures that we're projected to see in this area. So this is a map showing you again that the seasonality is important, and it's actually going to show you on the right where the coolest places in the summer and the winter are different, because not only are they different, but where they are can kind of tell us a little bit about what's important and where what is important is. So in the summer, that's in pink, the coolest places are down by the coast. In the winter, those are in blue, the coolest places are up in the north of our study area, which happen to be up really high in elevation, and they're kind of at the larger geographic scale, they're north, so further north from the equator. Areas that are cool for annual average are shown in gray. And so that was really important because the finding with the difference between summer, winter, and average, because a lot of climate connectivity estimates use annual average, and our results show that if you use annual average as your input for temperature, you're going to be missing these seasonal differences. So although annual average overlaps a little bit in some of the really cold places, it misses the places that capture seasonal extremes. And another way of looking at that is not just looking at places that we held the moment of silence for, those shrinking or disappearing cool places, but thinking, okay, so, we're going to be getting those 2 to 2.6 degree increases in temperature. Where is it going to be getting hotter? Where are we going to be seeing unprecedented hot spots? And so those would be places that are outside what we've experienced to date in terms of temperature. And again, we saw a seasonal difference. So the places that were cooler or that were hotter in the winter are going to be down in blue. They're going to be near the coast and toward the bay. So these are places where we are losing cool zones, cool refugia essentially. So if you want to get cooler winter, you're going to have to go inland. But again, the places that are getting hotter and will be unprecedentedly hot in the summer are at the east of our study area. So that's where we start getting into the Central Valley. And that's just going to be scorching. Yeah, and here this slide is going to break down that composite map a little here, showing where we're losing those cool spots in the summer. We're losing them at really high elevation, so mountain peaks, valley bottoms, and coastal areas. So there's a clear trend toward the coast for this. And in the winter, we're going to be losing those also at mountain peaks and also at valley bottoms. So, you know, these features across the landscape that are recurring as the coolest places, this goes back to that slide early on that I showed you about refugia. So the refugia, these are places where the coolest locations are. And so if we can protect these and connect them to other protected areas, that will be really important for buffering the region against climate change. So with that, like, crash course in a little bit of climate change and a sad tribute to shrinking climate spaces and disappearing cool places, I'm going to shift gears and go into how we actually calculated the climate benefit of those linkages, those terrestrial linkages. So here's a schematic showing two dummy protected areas, protected area 1 and protected area 2 in gray. So what we did is, for every linkage or least cost path that connected a protected area, we just did a simple calculation. We looked at the lowest temperature in protected area 1, lowest temperature in protected area 2, and subtracted them. So here in this example, the lowest temperature in protected area 1 is 5 degrees, and the lowest temperature in protected area 2 is 2 degrees. So if we can connect protected area 1 to 2, anything in protected area 1 suddenly gets like a power up. It can now access locations that are 3 degrees cooler, up to 3 degrees cooler across that linkage. So we assigned that difference to the least cost path that connected protected areas, and we called that the net cooling benefit. And here is what that looks like mapped on the least cost paths for the terrestrial connectivity. So I do show the annual average on the left, and these maps have a similar layout in that the least cost paths that provided the greatest benefit are thicker, their lines are thicker and the color is more vivid. So anything that least cost path that provided a benefit over 4 degrees Celsius, which is huge, those are in the most vibrant line. Least cost path that provided a 2 to 4 degrees Celsius benefit, which is nice, pretty nice. Those are the intermediate lines, and any other least cost path that was anything between 0 and 2 degrees Celsius is a really thin gray line, which you can barely see. And the point of that is to really highlight where the cooling benefit is greatest across these 3 temperature variables. So the summer maximum forecast was showing that the greatest cooling benefit is right in the heart of our study area. Connects like all of those red linkages in the center connect a lot to Mount St. Helena, and it connects from east, which is like right at our study boundary, through Mount St. Helena all the way over to the Berryessa Range. So the point of this project was to look at connectivity and climate resilience between the Mayacamas to Berryessa Range, and it looks like that kind of swath of protected areas and lands are really important for summer cooling benefit. The winter minimum results on the far right show totally different picture. They're showing that the places that are going to be the coolest in the winter are connected to the lands in the large polygon in the northeast of our study area, and again those are the places that are farther north from the equator and up in elevation.
Morgan, I think this might be a good time to talk about a question that we have in the chat. Speaking of connectivity and linking things, so Peter stated that the analysis that you guys have done largely is premised on connecting already existing protected areas. And he's wondering if there was any consideration given to identifying areas that are currently unprotected but that need to provide connectivity when protected areas alone don't provide enough options.
That is an excellent question, Peter. So yeah, first I want to say that is a known limitation with our approach. We justify it because we were working with a group of stakeholders who own or manage protected areas, and their interest was in identifying connections between their existing lands. So that's why we did it. However, understanding that there are other ways of doing it that are not like start and stop based, like they're not node to node like our approach was. I'm a curious nerd, so I accessed a commonly used and a really wonderful resource called Omniscape that the Nature Conservancy put out. And in contrast to our approach, which is node to node, their approach is a wall to wall. It's like it shows you connectivity across the whole landscape. It's an amazing resource. I encourage you to look it up. You can explore it online with their viewer. The cool thing was as I was digging into Omniscape, the places that were identified in the Omniscape viewer were as high priority for existing connectivity and future climate connectivity are basically the same as ours, and I can unpack that and say the reason why is because this approach and the Omniscape approach both use the same ecological integrity data as input. So it's taking the same ecological integrity for terrestrial connectivity. One is doing a node to node, that's us, and one is doing a wall to wall. But when you overlay them, the places that are the most connected in the Omniscape really overlap with the places that we identified as having a high linkage potential, or those least cost paths. All right, Margaret, are there any other questions in the chat?
Nope, so far that's it, but I welcome everyone to put your questions in your chat if you have them, and then we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Peter. I like the way you think. So this slide is just, I think we're getting close to the end of the climate benefit. So this is just the takeaway that the cooling linkages differ by season, depending on whether you want to find the coolest places in the summer or the coolest places in the winter. And when I started the project, I kind of got it. I was like, yeah, okay, you need to get to the cooler places in the summer because it gets hot. But why would you even need to get to cooler places in the winter? Like, how big of a deal is that? That was me in 2016, but now it's 2020 and I know, and I'm going to share the knowledge with you that I do know, which is not a lot, but it's a little more than I knew in 2016, which is that cold winters actually do matter. They're really important for, one thing that they're really important for is keeping out invasive species. So some species in California are they're totally fine with the hot summers and the cold winters, but invasive non-native species that come in from somewhere else and might disrupt our ecosystems, those often can't tolerate the cold winters. So if our cold winters go away, it's kind of like opening the gate. It can open the gate to less resilient invasive species. Also, plants also need a lot of cool winters. Sometimes plants need a cold snap or like a period of extreme cold for them to germinate. And that can be especially important in like nut trees and other stone fruits. So that's a whole agricultural industry that depends on cold winters. So having this understanding about where the cold summers are and where the cold winters are actually has a lot of different applications that can have a huge impact on how our lands are managed and how our economy, you know, proceeds as climate warms. So with that, I'm going to switch gears for the last time and talk to you about the corridors. So recall that the corridors were the parcel delineated places on the land that we take these like potential linkages and decide we're going to make a corridor, we're going to protect this land by buying it or restoring it and preserving it for open space and conservation. So out of all of the terrestrial linkages that we identified, there were 669. That's a lot. So our steering committee identified 6 of them that were high priority for climate resilience and connectivity. And part of that was based on like the climate benefit they offered. But you know, what was surprising is like, it was also informed by what's going on the ground. Like they have their ears on the ground. They could tell us like, oh yeah, this region is like slated for conversion to vineyard, or there's like a development project that's going through here. And so having an understanding of climate benefit and connectivity can give us some really hard data that we need to advocate for why the land should not be developed or converted. And so the map on the left shows you the corridors. So the first one is up in Walker Ridge, that's in the National Monument. The second is just south of Clear Lake. And then a whole little constellation of corridors were in the central part of our study area. So there was one in Alexander Valley, one in Knights Valley, one south of Pepperwood, Shiloh to Mark West, and then this really large network of linkages we called the heart of M2B because it was right in the heart of the project, and it also was essential for connecting the Mayacamas to Berryessa. And so at the center of the heart is Mount St. Helena. So for each of these 6 corridors, I went through and did parcel scale climate and connectivity assessments for all the parcels within the corridor. We wrote comprehensive corridor reports with all the data that can just be dropped into grant applications and proposals to assist in funding some of these conservation efforts. And we also worked with our collaborators to like increase their capacity to actually do the projects by identifying key collaborators and creating communication materials for them. I'm going to quickly show you a zoom in of one corridor that's close to my heart and close to where I work at Pepperwood is the Knights Valley Wildlife Corridor. You can see Pepperwood at the bottom of that new map, and then the Knights Valley Wildlife Corridor is about 3 miles between Pepperwood and a grouping of protected areas, including Modini, Santa Angelina, McCord, and some lands owned by the BLM. Right across the Knights Valley Wildlife Corridor is State Route 128. And so this is an important corridor for north-south connectivity, but it's also kind of interest because wildlife get killed on roads, so we're kind of wondering like how well does this work, and that's informed a lot of our kind of brainstorming for how to assess the actual connectivity potential of this region that we identified as important, and working with landowners and the community to get some more traction to implement some things that protect connectivity between the 2 properties. So here's, when I say we did some parcel scale assessments, this is what I mean. So look at the left side with the terrestrial connectivity. So on the far left, you see the familiar linkage potential map, which is, yeah, it's a heat map of how well a particular region is going to facilitate animal and ecosystem function, animal movement and ecosystem function. So for the parcel scale assessment, we went in and just took the parcel average. So what is the average at every single parcel in that in that corridor? And we did this not just for terrestrial connectivity, but for a suite of permeability, connectivity, and climate metrics. I think there was something like 30 something different metrics that were done at the corridor scale and at the parcel specific scale. And what this does is it gives land managers a parcel map that ranks each parcel according to a particular benefit that it has. So if you're looking at parcels and you're trying to evaluate which one, you want to protect one that has really great terrestrial connectivity, your eyes would be like zeroing in on the darkest green polygons, for example. And the darker brown would be kind of lower priority. And so that has been a really powerful tool for land managers that we've heard a lot of feedback that it has been directly informed grant applications and like management action. So I'm pretty glad to have made something that is working. And again, like it wasn't me, it was like the whole team. So the approach of bringing in the stakeholders early on like ensured that we created something that they can definitely use and that they are using. And in terms of the cooling benefit, I just want to give a shout out to this corridor because by connecting Pepperwood to that group of lands in the north, that would be a 5.5 degree Fahrenheit. Look at that, I converted to Fahrenheit at the end. A 5.5 degree Fahrenheit cooling benefit in the summer and over 1 degree cooling in the winter. So 3 miles, 5.5 degrees. That's wild. So it's pretty cool to, oh, that was a bad pun, but I'm not ashamed. So after we've done all this, what are we doing? How are we making things happen? So as I mentioned, we have built all these reports and we're helping our partners with communication materials. One of the things that we did that has been useful is we created some outreach materials in the form of a brochure that introduces like the concept of corridors and connectivity and provides some high-level things that landowners can do to improve connectivity in and around their lands. We also made the data publicly accessible. All the data, all the reports, all the communication materials are all up on Databasin. If you're interested, you should go over to Databasin and you can search in the box Maya Kamas to Berryessa and you'll be taken to our page. It's a very comprehensive resource. And if you're not a GIS person, Databasin is super cool because they have a web viewer. So any data that's up there, you can open on their web viewer, explore it, manipulate it, download it. So it's really been helpful for communicating. And we took an additional step. Instead of just providing the data to the public, we shared our connectivity data with the state California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Our connectivity results are on their BIOS database. So this was, again, based on feedback from stakeholders, is that they knew the lands had connectivity value and they could even provide the data supporting their claims. But sometimes, I guess in some cases, because our data wasn't in the statewide database, it didn't kind of make the cut for funding. So by putting our data into the appropriate database, in this case BIOS, it has helped our stakeholders be more competitive in their grant applications. So I believe we're wrapping up here. So I'm going to just share with you the key takeaways. So that question we asked originally, what connectivity exists between protected lands? What we found were that there are distinct functional pathways for riparian and terrestrial linkages. They overlapped a little bit in the developed areas because there's just not that many options for connectivity. But overall, they showed very different patterns. And in terms of which linkages offered long-term climate connectivity, one of the really cool things that we found was that there are really distinct annual and seasonal trends for seasonal warming and cooling linkages, and that these different directions and priorities offered different threats and also different opportunities for species depending on the conservation aim. And finally, how do we design climate-wise corridors? So our approach was to use, to identify a place that was very important for our stakeholder and create a portfolio of climate connectivity metrics at the linkage and at the corridor parcel scale, and just give them a really rich toolbox of data that they can plug and play depending on their needs. And one of the things that I didn't mention early, but I added a note here to remind myself, is that all of our data was at the 30 meter by 30 meter scale resolution. So that's how we were able to identify parcel specific averages, is that the riparian permeability, the climate data, and the ecological integrity data were all extremely high resolution. So rather than getting a regional map of what connectivity could look like, we used extremely high resolution data because our intent from the very beginning was to be able to do parcel scale information, derive parcel scale information that could then be used to inform decision making. And that's a wrap for me. Thank you for sticking with it. That was a lot of technical stuff. So I'm always really excited to share this information. Again, my name is Morgan Gray. My email is mgray@pepperwoodpreserve.org. And if there are questions that come up after this talk or things you didn't want to post in the chat, go ahead and shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you.